James Pinchbeck, Marketing Partner at Streets, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our payroll and HR update. Our sincere apologies for the slight delay in starting due to a technical glitch, but hopefully we can now get on with our presentation. For those watching live, the downloads are in, or the slides are in the downloads, plus some useful guides as well. This presentation is a presentation in two halves. The first half will be delivered by Teresa Waddingham, who's a partner and heads up the practice-wide payroll services. And the second half will be led by Anita Wynn, who's a director of Best Start HR. And she'll be talking about the employment rights and employment matters that are affecting businesses now and over the next 2 years. Teresa will give us an update on payroll legislation and things that you need to think about in the new payroll year, which starts on April the 6th. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Teresa. If you've got any questions and want to put them in the chat, we'll hopefully pick these up at the end, or what we've done in the past is respond directly to you following the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Right. Okay, so this is the agenda, what we're going to cover. It's a few things that I think are relevant at the moment that you might not have thought about. Working from home expenses, working from home when home's another country, national minimum wage, the living wage, NI and tax statutory payments, changes to the employment allowance that are coming up from April, how that affects connected entities, the employer's national insurance changes, what can be done to mitigate those, if anything, and what can we anticipate in the future. So working from home, I just wanted to touch on this because hybrid working is now the norm for most of us, and it's easy for these rules to be misunderstood. And obviously with payroll being where these expenses very often get put through as a reimbursement, I thought it would be good to cover this issue. So during COVID, the expenses element of working from home, if the employer is not paying them, was encouraged with a tax deduction for the employee, which they're responsible for claiming, and the eligibility requirements were relaxed, and employees were encouraged to claim via HMRC through the tax code. Many of you may have seen enhanced tax codes for your employees. However, this is different from the employer reimbursing the expenses. So what has changed? The criteria for employees to make the claim was tightened and much more restrictive, and tests needed to be followed for an employee to be followed for the employee to obtain the exemption. When an employer is reimbursing the employee, the rules are slightly different. So the employer can reimburse the employee at £6 a week or £26 a calendar month, free of tax and national insurance. This is a free of evidence amount, not a maximum. Greater amounts can be paid where the employer provides evidence to justify them. Now, there are only two conditions for the relief, where this is classed as home working arrangements, and two tests must be met. There must be arrangements between the employer and the employee, and the employee must work at home regularly under those arrangements. There's no particular definition of what regular means. However, it shouldn't be informal, it should be frequent, and it should follow a pattern. If you're claiming and if you're putting through the payroll and any other basis, I would suggest revisiting that and just to make sure that you are meeting those tests. Now, this is another area that I'm asked regularly regarding employers who want to employ an overseas worker remotely. And this is fraught with peril. So the issues to consider is what I'm going to highlight today, so that they give you an indication of where to go. So first of all is right to work. Although this is a UK concept that there's right to work for employees in the UK, there may be reporting implications in the country that the employee is living and working. So they need to be considered. Social insurance liabilities and reporting obligations. National insurance, Social Security as a general rule of thumb is payable in the country that you're working in. However, there are a number of agreements with the UK that has reciprocal agreements with the EU and some other countries. And there is the option to look at that and see if there's a way for the employee to register and then they pay in whichever country that they actually want to. But this has consequences for the employer because it's where the payroll is processed and how the contributions are made. Social insurance rates can vary enormously between country to country. And also local law may require non-resident employers to operate payroll deductions. So obviously you need to look at that and be careful. It could block access for the employee to healthcare and retirement pensions in the country that they're actually living if they don't pay them. If the employee is returning periodically to the UK to carry out duties, then this causes an issue because of which country the liability arises and which country to process the payroll. Income tax and reporting obligations, rule on income tax are different to national insurance. Some countries require employers to comply by withholding tax. So you could end up the employee could end up in a situation where they're having to pay tax in both countries. The area to be really careful about is permanent establishment risk. And that is because that can vary from country to country. And if you create a permanent establishment in a country that exposes a portion of profit earned in the UK to the other country's corporate tax. Employment law, it may be that they then become eligible to the employment law of the country that they're living in. And obviously that may have unintended consequences. So as you can see, this is an extremely complex area. We do have a tax department at Streets that would be more than happy, that has extensive experience in this field, should you be interested in that. Now going on to the bit that has come through from April, national minimum wage, national living wage. Obviously, it's got extreme consequences if you don't comply. And it's really important that you do check all your employees at the beginning of the tax year, especially with the rates increasing to what they are now. From April, £12.21 for anybody over 21. So I've put a couple of calculations together based on an average 37.5 hour week. These are the salaries that you should be looking at when you're comparing what you've paid previously and to make sure that you're compliant. The statutory rates, obviously they've all gone up very slightly. The only thing I would like to mention that was interesting that hasn't actually been in the press but did actually just appear through was if you are a small employer, your class 1, both employee and employer is below 45,000 for the previous year, and you claim statutory maternity, paternity, shared parental, any of those statutory payments, from April 25, you can now claim 108.5% recovery through PAYE as opposed to 103% previously. So it's more important than ever to keep a check of what your employee and employer national insurance is for the prior year. Obviously, if you're eligible, you want to be ticking that box on your software to make sure that you're making those submission so that you're being able to claim it. Student loan plans have gone up, earnings thresholds, a couple of them have gone up, some and 2 of them haven't changed, but just have a look at those. Obviously, your software should do the work for you, but as long as you're aware of what they should be, then obviously it keeps you up to date. Now, changes to the employment allowance. This has been a bit of a minefield. The thing to watch with this is obviously now they're going to be increasing the employment allowance to 10,500 from April. And they've removed the 100,000 employer national insurance restriction that applied. There's a large number of employers that are now going to be able to claim. So I'm sure that you're looking at this, having all the press that we've had on this, but it's really important that you do look at it thoroughly, because there are lots of caveats to that. So to be able to claim, you must activate the indicator and submit it to HMRC. It may be included within your EPS submission. It may be a separate submission. Once you've submitted that indicator at the start of the tax year, that's all you actually have to do to claim with HMRC. So once the indicator is on, HMRC should automatically apply whatever allowance you're eligible to obtain each month once you've submitted your FPS submission. That's where they're taking the information from, and that's what will go through, and that's where the credit will be applied. You should be able to see it from a payroll perspective on your P32 to be able to balance it to what you're actually seeing on your HMRC dashboard. Secondly, de minimis state aid. That was included, employment allowance was included as part of de minimis state aid, and this was very confusing for everybody, especially affecting agriculture and fisheries, is to know whether you'd got state aid or not. The good news is that they have HMRC has decided that it's not actually going to be included as state aid from April. So it's something that you no longer have to worry about from April 2025. Thing that you do need to be aware of it is how other elements to your business might affect what you can claim. If you've become part of a group structure where the allowance is being claimed elsewhere, has the group dissolved, shareholders changed, so you now be able to claim on other companies? Have you got a partnership that you could claim on and a limited company? The various scenarios that can make this a complex area for claiming. And obviously with HMRC, having it broadened and the value that's involved, we have seen previously that they have marketed information out to companies as to saying, check your company structure because we believe that you're part of a group. This is an area that we think HMRC will target. If you have more than one PAYE scheme on your limited company, you can only claim the allowance on one. Deciding if one company is connected to another is where you need to look at common control. The amount available to claim increasing and the removal of the 100K restriction, it's more important than ever that if you're a director of more than one company, that you actually look at the whole situation of the businesses that you're involved with. And if you have common control, you can only claim it on one company. So please review that eligibility. Be wary of restructuring in order to maximise your claim, as there is anti-avoidance legislation in place. You would need to justify your actions on that. Subsidiary companies, it's important to understand what's happening with the parent companies. So are they claiming, have they got another PAYE scheme elsewhere that you don't know about? Obviously, if the more information that you can obtain, the more transparent you are, then the less likely you are to come into problems if you do have an overclaim. Your payroll provider will need your input to know if to claim. They are not going to know what your company structure is. They can only know that you of the payroll that they have based on the company that you've given them. So please be aware that you are going to have to be transparent and provide that information to your payroll provider so they can claim it on your behalf. The interesting thing is, if you have more than one PAYE scheme that does not use the full allowance, you can actually apply to HMRC to get a refund of any unused balance of the two combined together. So, and if you don't apply for a refund, you can apply to use that against any forthcoming PAYE. So definitely something to be aware of if you have multiple schemes. National insurance. So obviously, I'm sure you've seen all this in the press with what's been happening. So essentially what's changing is the percentage is increasing for employers from 13.8 to 15%, and the threshold from which employer national insurance is generated is changing to 5,000 per annum. So what's the effect on that? Instantly, any employee that earns over 9,100 per year, straight away there will be £615 per employee extra in employer national insurance. Then you've got the increase of 1.2% on earnings. Then you've got part-time workers that were previously not liable, not generating employers' national insurance, who are now falling into the net because of the drop threshold. If you're an employer with 6 employees or under, you shouldn't actually see any increase. It's the majority of the employers above 6 employees that is going to be affected. Lower earnings limit and secondary threshold implications. The secondary threshold, which is the employer's threshold, is now, from April, is going to be below the lower earnings limit. So what does that actually mean? All the benefits that an employee receives is based on lower earnings limit. Therefore, you can argue that the employee will not actually receive the benefit, even though the employer is paying employer national insurance. By dropping the secondary threshold, it may mean that previously you haven't had to have a PAYE scheme, but now you do. So please be aware of that. With regards to pensions, as it's an add-on cost, they do not actually, that will not actually affect a pension contribution. What will, however, is the national minimum wage, and any additional pay will now generate an additional 1.2%. So what can we do about it? How can we make it easier on ourselves as a company? There are one or two things that we can look at, and although it appears all to be doom and gloom, there are a few things that you can do to maximise the benefit. If you're a small employer, do look at what you've generated in employer national insurance this year. If you are, it may be that you've decided not to increase your employee numbers because of these increases, but it could be that you could benefit, because if you've got gap up to the 10,500 that is going to be available to claim for employment allowance, it may be that you need to factor that in when you're looking at your growth strategy. If you're part of a group, do look at which PAYE scheme generates the most employer national insurance, because when you make your decision on which PAYE scheme to apply it to, obviously you want to choose the one that's generating the most employer national insurance. If you're restructuring, it may be that you can continue to claim employment allowance on both schemes. So do take advice on this, because it may be possible that for the first year at least, you may be able to claim it on both. Apprentices Employer national insurance is not generated on apprentices until they earn above the upper earnings limit, which is next year will be 50,270. There's strict rules on being able to apply this, and it is HMRC do frequently target apprenticeships to see that they're being paid the minimum wage. But it is something that if you haven't considered apprentices before, it may be something that again can come into your business strategy. There is such a thing as Freeport investment zones. They cover specific areas, and if you have qualifying employees in those, again, the employer national insurance is not applied. They have specific thresholds until after 25,000. So it may be that if you're in one of those areas and you take on your employees, you may be able to benefit from that. Veterans, they have their own limit, and if they're in their first year of first employment post since leaving the forces, they you don't pay employer national insurance on that until they reach the upper earnings limit. Salary sacrifice, excuse me, whilst HMRC has contracted this quite a lot, pensions is still the area that can be sacrificed. So essentially, when an employee salary sacrifice pensions contributions, they give up the equivalent of the pension contribution from their salary. And this amount is given back by the employer through the pension as employer contributions. So because it's affecting their salary, it is it does have implications on the employee. It shouldn't go below minimum wage. It does mean the employee benefits from national insurance and tax relief through the payroll, but it is a contractual variation. So please do research or obtain advice in this area if you want to go ahead with this, because there are HR implications on going down this route. Anita and her team are well versed in this area. If you need advice on that, I'm sure they'd be willing to have a look at it for you if that's a route that you're interested in taking. So, changes on the horizon, what have we got coming up? So fortunately, I mentioned last year that employees' actual hours, HMRC were changing it so that they could submit those in, so you would have to submit them in each period. Fortunately, HMRC has listened to the industry specialists on that, and they've decided not to go ahead with it. So that's good news. From April 2026, you will start seeing the first Student Loan Plan 5s appearing. They should not appear before this because of the dates that they were issued, but you should see them from April 2026. State pension age is rising to 67 in 2026, and unfortunately likely to go higher than that from the consultations that are going on at the moment. One thing to note is to check your software. If you're in any doubt about changing the employee's national insurance category to category C, do put it through the online checker, because obviously you want to make sure that you're applying the correct national insurance category to your employees. And of course, mandating payrolling benefits in kind, but that's still being reviewed by HMRC as the practicalities, how it's going to work through the software. And we're hoping we'll have more concrete information on that soon, but we'll do a separate information on that once it's been nailed down as to actually how it's going to work. And then we have the Employment Rights Bill. And whilst the majority of this does not, will eventually reach payroll in some form, the part that has direct impact is the removal of qualifying periods for statutory payments, and the removal of low earnings limit for statutory sick pay. but the Anita will go through the Employment Rights Bill with you, and obviously it's not been finalised as yet. And that's all I have for you today. And I will pass on to Anita.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Teresa, and welcome from a very grey, but of course, as always, warmly welcoming Lincoln, where we're recording this today. Thank you, James, and everyone at Streets for inviting me to speak again at this webinar. I have to say that I feel that Teresa and I are rather the bringers of doom today with all of this new legislation, which will certainly not be welcomed by many small and medium-sized businesses who are already experiencing challenges through a rather dull and flat economic situation that we are at the moment. But hopefully today you're going to leave with some practical advice that will put the employment legislation into a little bit of perspective. I can see we've already got some questions in the right-hand side. If there are any other questions, I'll be happy to take them at the end. Otherwise, as we've done in previous years, we'll follow up on email to everyone who asks a question. So please feel free to interact. Now, following many years of a stable employment legislative environment, the departing Conservative government decided to push through a raft of changes, some minor and others a little bit more substantial, which took effect last year in 2024. And then this has been followed by the Labour Party's plan to make work pay, which was detailed in their manifesto and has been translated mainly into the Employment Rights Bill, which we've already heard Teresa mention, and I'm sure you've seen in the media as well. This started its legislative journey through Parliament in October last year in 24. Now, today, I'm going to do a quick recap of 2024 changes, paying particular attention to the change to the sexual harassment legislation, which came into force in October. So you can all make sure that you've done all those changes and implemented them before we start looking at 2025. I'm then going to outline the very few pieces of legislation that we'll have to put to mind in 2025. And then I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about the Employment Rights Bill and when that's going to come into effect. We've got plenty of time to get our heads around that one. So despite what everyone in the media is telling us at the moment. So let me just put up a slide that I had last year. And as I said, I'm going to do a quick run through of these just to make sure that everyone knows what they should have been doing. So the first one on the list there implemented a change to the way that holiday pay is calculated. And it caused a lot of consternation last year, also a lot of groaning. And it particularly applies to those people who have irregular earnings, i.e. those people who also earn overtime, commission, contractual bonuses, and those who in like annual hours contracts where their pay is irregular. Now, all of you should have implemented this by now. It was implementable from the next holiday year. So if you haven't done that yet, please reach out and get some guidance on that one. Flexible working became a day one right, and there was a few minor changes to the process that we use in order to consider flexible working requests. Paternity leave can now be split, so the 2 weeks leave that fathers are entitled to can now be split into 2 times 1 week periods, and that can be taken in any time in the first year of the child's life. Carers leave put in an introduction of an entitlement to specific leave for those who have caring responsibilities. And not quite last, but the one before that, the Protection from Redundancy Act, this gives pregnant ladies through into maternity 18 months protection from being made redundant. Now, it doesn't mean that they can't be made redundant, make that really, really clear, but they do have more protection for the period of time in which they're pregnant on maternity leave and then when they come back afterwards. So you do need to be a little bit cautious. And if you are conducting a redundancy process with people who are currently on maternity leave, do make sure you seek advice. I'm going to spend most of my time before we move on looking at 2025, focusing on the Worker Protection Agreement of Equality Act 2010, Act 2023. Now, this piece of legislation came into effect in the 26th of October 2024, but we are still seeing people who haven't addressed this. So I wanted to just make sure I go through with you what you need to be done. Now, this piece of legislation places greater onus on employers to take reasonable anticipatory steps to prevent sexual harassment of employees and also self-employed workers, both inside and outside of the workplace, whilst an employee is on company business. Now, this is a significant change to the previous approach to harassment, which focused only on the action that someone needed to take when an allegation is made. Now, employees will continue to be able to bring a claim at an employment tribunal, and if that tribunal should decide that preventative measures are not in place, then they can choose to apply a 25% uplift to any award. And bearing in mind, the awards for harassment are currently uncapped. So as well as that, employees will also be able to make a complaint to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So let's have a look at what these preventative measures are. Now, in deciding what would be thought of as a preventative measure, we believe that factors such as your size, your sector, your working environment, your resources are likely to be taken into consideration. However, to be really clear, this legislation applies to all businesses, irrespective of their size, and therefore all small businesses will be required to have taken some action or to take some action going forward. Now, we've got some guidance now from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which since October has changed twice, but it's been pretty stable for the last couple of months. So it provides us with a little bit more information on what might be considered reasonable preventative measures. And I want to go through some of those with you today. So the first one is conducting a risk assessment. So using your normal framework that you would do for risk assessments, say with health and safety or other business risks, you need to carry out a risk assessment to identify the risks of harassment or victimization and the control measures that you've either already got in place or intend to put in place to minimize the risk. So it's just the same approach as you would do with health and safety. Now, the sort of factors and risks that you might consider are included in that set of guidance. The sorts of things that we're finding most common are things like lone or night working, the presence of alcohol, not necessarily in the workplace, but in work-related events, maybe customer-facing activities, a lack of diversity in the workplace. So if you've got a predominantly male workforce or a predominantly female workforce, that might cause the likelihood of harassment or victimization increasing, but also where we've got large power imbalances. We also need you to review and update your policies and procedures, and that's anti-harassment or maybe equality and diversity policies, to ensure that they encourage reporting of such instances and also provide a really clear and consistent framework for handling any allegations that are raised. It's sensible because the definition of harassment is really broad, to make sure in your policies and processes that you define what harassment is, including sexual harassment, and provide some examples to bring that to life. It's also important that they address what to do where a third-party harassment occurs, so maybe from a customer or a client or other parties, because this is now the employer's responsibility. A review of other connected policies and procedures might also be sensible. So, for example, you might want to look at your codes of conduct, your disciplinary policy, use of IT equipment, internet and social media policies, maybe your dress codes, use for alcohol and drugs on company business. So quite a vast range of policies that might be impacted by this change. And of course, if you don't have an anti-harassment policy, you really need to introduce one now. We're also being encouraged to review our reporting mechanisms. So ensuring employees who believe that they have been a victim of harassment are comfortable and know how to report it. Employers might wish to think about anonymised reporting or use of external third-party reporting facilities, or maybe just defining options so that employees know that they have a range of people that they may be able to report things to. These need to be communicated to employees along with also the policies and procedures. These should then, once they've been communicated, stored or displayed somewhere so everyone, including employees and workers, can access them. It's also really important to make sure that we communicate these to other forms of workers, so agency workers, self-employed, or volunteers, because this piece of legislation covers all of those individuals. Training is going to be a key one, and many people have already started doing the training on this. So training should be provided to all new employees or new workers through some form of induction process. And all employees should also receive it on a fairly regular basis. So some of you might already do anti-bribery or anti-money laundering training. This needs to become part of that annual process as well. We need to make sure that people understand what harassment and victimisation is, how they should report it, and also what to do if there's been third-party harassment, maybe from customers or clients. I suggest also separate manager training is going to be essential, because managers are likely to be the first line of support that people are likely to go and talk to, but also might recognise behaviours before they become too serious. So please make sure that you have got some of that training in place. Finally, looking at monitoring and reporting. So employers might want to think about incorporating questions on employee surveys to make sure they've got a full and complete picture of harassment. It might also be advisable to create like a harassment register. So a bit like that data breach register that we're supposed to have under GDPR. And that way we can record cases that have been reported and the actions we've taken. This could be a really key part of demonstrating preventative measures. So whilst all of that might seem quite a daunting task for any small business, it's absolutely critical in the current environment. A survey carried out by the ONS in 2023 found that 10% of people aged 16 or over had experienced at least one form of harassment that made them feel distressed or uncomfortable or threatened in the previous 12 months. Sexual harassment was experienced by 8% of women compared with 3% of men. Although I would really like to stress that sexual harassment can occur between same sexes and also a woman honor a man, as well as the traditional thing that we think of most of the time, i.e. a man on a woman. 3/4 of victims of harassment experience this behaviour in person, and 1 in 5 experienced it online. And 1/4 of those who'd experienced sexual harassment said they'd experienced it in the workplace. So your first steps is to conduct that risk assessment that I talked to you about, and then follow those steps that I outlined in the previous slide. I've also in the downloads produced a handout which goes through those things in a little bit more detail. Or of course, please feel free to reach out, and happy to help. Or of course, your normal advisors will be able to do so too. So let's then move on and look at what does 2025 look like for us in terms of legislative changes. And actually, in terms of things that we're going to have to do in 2025, it's quite light, despite everything that everyone's saying. So the first thing is the Neonatal Care Leave and Pay Act 2023. And what this does, it grants parents the right to 12 weeks of leave and pay if their baby requires neonatal care. And this is in addition to their existing parental leave entitlement. So on top of maternity and paternity rights. We're still waiting for some of that detail to come out in terms of exactly what that's going to look like, but we believe it's going to come into effect on the 6th of April 2025. Now, statutory code of practice on the right to switch off. This was in the Labour Party's manifesto. We were expecting it to be in the Employment Rights Bill, but they have decided to do this differently and instead to issue a statutory code of practice, which we intend, or we believe we'll see in 2025. This has been something that's been introduced in many countries, most sort of notably in France most recently. And what this is the right for employees not to be contacted out of hours by their employers. Now, at the moment, we don't know what the Labour government are going to do and what it's going to look like in the UK. What we do know, though, is that the government is not intending to introduce an outright ban on employers contacting employees outside of work. We know that they're likely to adopt a similar pattern to some of the other countries. So, for example, at the moment, Ireland have a non-binding code of practice, which requires employees and employers to discuss and create a tailored policy that's suitable for their workplace. Belgium has something similar, but only applies to employers with over 20 employees. So we know that they're going to introduce a statutory code of practice, likely to be this year, rather than a full legislative change. And we believe that it's going to be something like the statutory code for disciplinary, which will mean that tribunals will be able, if a company has not followed the statutory code, to uplift compensation. And the final one is the Paternity Leave Bereavement Act 2024. This actually received royal assent back in May 2024 and is expected to take an impact some point this year, although we have no specific dates at the moment. This act will remove the usual 26-week minimum service requirement for fathers and partners to take paternity leave if the mother of their child dies shortly after childbirth. So whilst a very important piece of legislation, it is likely to only impact a very small number of employees. And we're going to see further changes to things like paternity leave, we believe, in the Employment Rights Act. Which brings me nicely onto what is 2026 going to look like and what legislative changes are beyond. Now, the government's Employment Right Bill has been a real favourite topic for the media since the Labour Party was elected last year. And there has been a huge range of scaremongering with having countdowns on websites and what have you to when it was going to be put into Parliament. Now, whilst these changes are going to be substantial and will definitely require a rethink for many of us in how we handle some of those employment situations, we have plenty of time to prepare. So at the end of last year, the government sought some feedback on various aspects of the Employment Rights Bill, and we understand that there will be further consultations this year in 2025. We will make sure we flag those to all of our clients so that if you'd like your say on some of the provisions, you'll be able to do so. However, even after that, the Employment Rights Bill will have to undergo scrutiny in Parliament. No doubt there'll be further proposed amendments through that period, and therefore it's expected not to be passed in law no earlier than summer 2025, with most of the reforms taking effect in 2026. So we've got plenty of time. So I really don't want you to focus too much on that at the moment. I'd much rather you got your sexual harassment things in place. But just so, because I know so many people are worried about some of these things, I'm just going to run through very quickly those key provisions. But as I said, we can leave these this time next year. Hopefully I'll be standing here and we'll talk about them then, because we'll know a little bit more detail at that point. Now, the one that everyone is really worried about is this day one right against unfair dismissal. Now, what this will do is remove the current 2-year service provision to bring an unfair dismissal claim, which many of us use to address performance and fit concerns in that early part of employment. Now, those of you with grey hair like me will remember we've done 2 years, we've done 1 year, we've done 2 years, and now we're going to have no years. So look, it's fine. There will be ways that we can make sure we manage this through. So it will be a substantial mind shift, but we've been told that it will not be implemented any sooner than autumn 2026. So at the moment, nothing changes. Harassment will undergo yet further changes. So beyond those I've already talked to you about, it will include introducing liability for third-party harassment on employers in respect of all types of harassment. So at the moment, it's just sexual harassment. It will go to all harassment. And disclosures about sexual harassment will be classed as a protected disclosure. And therefore, those who report things will be protected under the whistleblowing regime. There's going to be some restrictions on zero-hour contracts, and I know that's a real worry for many people in certain industries who really make good use of those zero-hour contracts, and employees who really enjoy them too. It's going to propose a limit on zero-hours contracts. Employers are going to be required to offer guaranteed hours to zero-hour workers and those on low guaranteed hours who regularly work beyond what their minimum is. And additionally, workers will be compensated or will need to be compensated for shifts that are cancelled or are going to end early. There's going to be restrictions on fire and rehire. Now, this is not something that most small businesses have used previously because it's been notoriously difficult to implement safely. But fundamentally, this is where you attempt to do a contract variation and where you can't get consultation and agreement with your employees, you fire them and then rehire them on the new terms and conditions. So this is going to be automatically unfair. But again, I would imagine that it's not going to have a huge impact on most people listening to this today. There's going to be some other day one rights. We've already heard a few of those from Teresa, so relating to statutory sick pay, for example, but also unpaid parental leave, paternity leave, a new statutory right to paid bereavement leave at the moment, other than parental bereavement, so bereavement of children. General bereavement is covered under the emergency leave provisions, which allows for people to have a reasonable amount of time off unpaid. So we're going to see a little change there. And there's going to be yet more enhanced maternity protection. We're waiting to see the details on all of those. One that is a slight concern, I know, for many people is the changes to flexible working. So yet more changes to the flexible working provision. What we understand is that employers are only going to be able to refuse requests if they have a reasonable basis to do so. And employers will have to state the specific grounds for refusal and why the refusal is reasonable. So quite a bit of onerousness on that, and particularly as we're working at the moment, seeing lots of employers looking at hybrid working patterns, going back to the office, etc. I know that's going to be a worry. But again, this will be 2026 before that comes into place. In my last few minutes, I just want to also cover a little bit about some of the other things that we're going to see in 2026 and beyond. So the first one, the Equality, Race and Disability Bill. This will extend pay gap reporting, which is currently just done on sex pay gap reporting. This will now cover ethnicity and disability, but will only apply to employers with more than 250 employees. There'll be some other slight changes as well in terms of discrimination, and employers will be prohibited from using outsourcing services to circumnavigate these equal pay obligations. This is we're likely to see that draft bill by spring 2025, but of course it's got to go through the same process as the Employment Rights Bill I talked about earlier. So we're unlikely to see this until 2026. The government has also promised a consultation on developing a simpler framework for employment status, looking at the introduction of a single worker status, which will be differentiated from genuine self-employed. Those of you who are regulars to this will have heard me previously talk about the complexity of what is an employee, what is a worker, who is a genuine self-employed worker, inside the IR35, outside IR35. So this has been an area of confusion for many years. The current government has said that they will look at that. We have no details further. So I think that's a watch this space. And there's also a pension scheme bill that we're likely to see come through, looking at some changes to both defined contribution and defined benefit schemes. Unlikely to see much else on that front. So finally, as we sort of head into this new period of people-related change, both in terms of practices and laws, you may want to think about how you facilitate your HR provision and your HR advice. So I just wanted to highlight through Streets HR, we are welcoming inquiries for any of our HR services, which include both an outsourced HR administration service, as well as coming along the spectrum HR consultancy for some of those specific challenges that you might be facing. For any of you with more than 10 employees, we offer a complimentary HR audit to look at your current provision and make some recommendations to ensure that you're legally compliant and you've got those foundations in place before we start looking at these changes. There's a download there with some details of that, but if anyone would like to give me a call, I'd be happy to talk those through. So look at that, I've managed to stay on time and get ourselves back onto a 12 o'clock finish. I'd like to hand over to James now, who will wrap up for us today.
Thank you, Anita. Come on, commensurate professional and timing. You should get a job in TV. And thank you for your presentation. I think you described it as doom and gloom, but I think also it's important for businesses to reflect on the importance of having staff and why we employ people. It is challenging time, but all this legislation and all this changes around NI and etc. might put us under pressure, but it's vital that we reflect on the importance of our employees and how they contribute to the success of the business. Anita's details are in the slides, which are now available in the handout on the downloads. And also, can I also stress this is a good time of year if you've now got a headache of thinking about your payroll, if we don't do your payroll, to outsource your payroll to Streets, or on the basis that it can relieve the headache and allow you to focus on the things that matter in your business, and to run the business in this challenging time. Thank you also from us for joining us. We hope to see you at further webinars in the future. I'll just give a quick plug for our spring statement presentation, which will take place in March, and the details will be shared over the next coming weeks or available on our website. And again, thank you to both speakers, and again, thank you for joining us.